also the fact that the Russians blew up the Kakhovka Dam has helped drain the waters in that part of the river. So, in fact, it's easier for Ukrainians to get across that areas of land.
So, Maxim, in today's article for The Times, you've told the story of the Ukrainian kill squads, and they're picking off Putin's commanders inside of Russia. How are they doing this?
So they're taking advantage of the fact that Russia has deployed most of its active forces in the south of Ukraine. So they've left the Bryansk and Belgorod regions of Russia unprotected on the northern border with Ukraine. And Ukraine has already sought to exploit that by sending Russian partisans who are aligned with Kiev across the border to try and cause problems for the Russians in those regions. And this special forces unit, the Shaman battalion, the Ukrainian special forces unit, told me that they have sometimes accompanied and escorted those Russian partisans into Russian territory, and then they've broken off on their own missions to go and hunt for and kill senior Russian commanders in those areas.
How many Russian commanders do we estimate that they've killed?
Well, they wouldn't give numbers and they wouldn't give names for obvious reasons, but they said that they have committed more than 10 of these operations over the past 6 months. So, some of them may have been successful, some of them may not have been successful, but that's what they were prepared to say to me. We know that Russia has admitted losing 6 generals in the war and actually over 100 colonels. So it's a really high casualty count for senior officers, and this might help explain some of those casualties.
How significant of a loss is this for the Russian military, which seems to be in somewhat of a state of disarray?
It's very disruptive to have senior officers killed. It's bad for morale as well. It complicates Russia's logistics and command and control functions even further when they've already had difficulties massing their forces for offensives and motivating their troops. So it's further disruption and further problems for the Russian forces.
And what other operations have this group been involved in?
So they weren't specific about the operations, but they did talk about taking on targets as large as airbases. And we know that there have been 2 attacks on Russian strategic bomber bases hundreds of miles inside Russian territories. We don't know quite the results of those because Russia has always sought to downplay them, but certainly they will have an impact on Russia in terms of having to allocate more resources to guarding those areas and disrupting preparations on those bases for strikes against Ukraine. So there's 2 air bases that we've seen attacked inside Russia, and then other air bases we've seen attacked inside Crimea far more frequently.
The Times encountered these forces last year. How much has changed in terms of how they're operating between last year and this year?
So when we revealed they were crossing the border for the first time, this time around, well, a little bit earlier than this time last year, it was a big surprise because people had thought the Ukrainians were limited to operating on their own territory. And they conceded that, in fact, they had been across into Russian territory and they were hitting infrastructure objects, so trying to disrupt the logistics chain, hitting supply bases and TV masts and radio masts and things like this to try and disrupt communications. They've now grown. They've become, because of their heroics, everywhere from the defense of Hostomel Airport to an assault on Snake Island. They're very popular, and people who are very highly motivated want to join their forces. So they've grown from a kind of a smaller special operations group to a big battalion with hundreds of people involved in their missions. And that has meant that they've had to take on some of the kind of nitty-gritty work of defending trenches and special operations that require them to stay on positions for months at a time, such as defending the Road of Life, as it's called, to Bakhmut, which was allowing Ukrainian resupply in the city when it was besieged by the Russians. But they've also decided that they are now competent enough and experienced enough to take on these more daring raids where they go further into Russia, deeper into Russia, and target really big targets such as air bases.
Do we know if they've received any sort of like Western training or anything to kind of get to that point?
Well, some of them will have received Western training, and some of them been fighting since 2014 when Russia first launched its hybrid invasion of the Donbass. And we know from previous interviews with them that their soldiers had received special forces training from the Brits and from the Americans during that period of time from 2014 to now. They obviously are not telling us about any further training that they received, but really I think this unit is very, very involved in the war effort and do not have a great deal of time for training. When we talked about trainings, they said actually we've got more to offer the NATO allies now because we have so much experience of fighting the Russians and know more about this type of combat that NATO hasn't been experienced in for a very long time.
They are using some Western equipment to do this. One of them is a US Black Hawk helicopter. I mean, doesn't that kind of go against the Western warnings not to be using their equipment inside Russian borders?
No, it doesn't, because the US Black Hawk helicopter is actually privately purchased. It wasn't given by the US military. They purchased it privately. There are some contractors that have them. And it was purchased without any armament. So they've taken the Black Hawk and they've fitted their own machine guns on it. There has been some controversy with Belgium because they've got special assault rifles that were produced in Belgium. But none of the kind of the heavy armaments that the Ukrainians had promised not to use against Russia are being used in Russia.
Every time you reveal something like this to us, we get loads of comments saying, "Stop sharing this. Stop sharing what the Ukrainians are doing." I mean, is there danger in you sharing this information publicly with us?
Well, it's important to remember the Ukrainians don't talk to me under duress. They are happy, willing to talk to me, and they share details that they think will be useful for them to share. And sometimes that is a judgment call about the balance, the impact on morale and the impact on Russian morale versus the impact on their mission. So they share with me a level of detail that they're comfortable with in order to achieve that objective without rendering the other objective more difficult. I mean, I think at this point we've seen that there are Ukrainian-backed incursions into Russia already. We've seen the partisan movements. There's a lot of these things that Russia will already be aware that is happening, and they share with me perhaps a little bit more detail about how that works, but not enough to give away anything that is an active operation.
I wanted to just ask you a few questions just in general about how the counteroffensive is shaping up. How are we seeing the counteroffensive progress? It seems to have been quite stagnant, but are we seeing things move a little bit more?
So it's been slow going. I mean, there's been movement. There's a lot of fighting. There's a heavy artillery barrages going on every day, and the Ukrainians have made progress, but slow progress measured in kind of hundreds of meters and single-digit kilometers, because they've, at the beginning of the counteroffensive, they experienced quite a lot of vehicle losses. And they're worried that they won't get those vehicles replenished by the West. So they've now chosen to dismount from those vehicles and are sending troops in infantry on infantry combat, which is really grueling, difficult warfare. And is perhaps not the right decision. I mean, if they had more reassurances from the West that those vehicles would all be replaced, then they might seek to conserve human manpower more efficiently, and rather than being so worried about sacrificing vehicles. But we have seen last night a very interesting river crossing of the Dnipro, where Ukrainian special forces, in a considerable number, in the hundreds, have crossed the Dnipro on boats and taken some Russian positions on the Russians-occupied bank of the Dnipro. And those special forces seem to be now withdrawing and leaving regular infantry to hold those positions. They will face a difficult task to keep those positions resupplied. But it does appear to be a significant attempt to dislodge the Russians from that side of the Dnipro, or at the very least to distract and to move some of the Russian forces away from defending against the main thrust of the counteroffensive in Zaporizhia region.
Last week, you were writing about the Dnipro Delta and kind of these little islands in the river that Ukraine was taking back with the help of British vets. Do you think that's come into play as to how they were able to take that overnight?
Definitely, those actions taking islands on the Dnipro River Delta have provided a staging post to get across the Dnipro, and also the fact that the Russians blew up the Kakhovka Dam has helped drain the waters in that part of the river. So, in fact, it's easier for Ukrainians to get across that areas of land. But it's still a very, very tough battle. It's going to be very difficult to supply those units that have got a foothold on the other side. We've seen the Russians really being quite determined to drive the Ukrainians out from a bridgehead near the Antonovsky Bridge. And they've used kind of very heavy weaponry and 500-pound bombs to try and get the Ukrainians out, but they're still clinging on there. So the interesting part will be now, can the Ukrainians keep these bridgeheads resupplied, and can they move from a bridgehead into expanding their operations on the other side of the Dnipro?
So you're saying from a battle perspective, blowing up the dam, I mean, of course, there was a huge cost to human life and there were humanitarian concerns. But from a battle perspective, it actually kind of backfired on the Russians. It's made it much easier for Ukraine.
Well, it was much easier. In the first instance, it delayed the Ukrainian offensive across the Dnieper. I think the Ukrainians were planning to try and launch a direction of attack across the Dnieper anyway, and so they haven't been able to do that in tandem with the Zaporizhia offensive, which has been to Russia's advantage. But now, as the floodwaters dry out, those areas of lands are actually easier to cross than they were before, and also Russia washed away some of its defensive positions, which has made it a little bit easier to get across. But it's still very difficult because on the other bank of the Dnieper, it's still very heavily mined. There are marine mines in the Dnieper River itself. So the Ukrainians still face an uphill struggle to try and get across that, especially without air power when you've got Russian attack helicopters that can be targeting boats on the river, that can be targeting tanks and anything that you do get across as soon as it's across. So it's still going to be very tough going.
There were reports this morning of Ukrainian drones being destroyed over Moscow and an explosion at a Russian factory. I mean, this combined with what you've revealed in your piece in the Times, it shows how the war is spilling over into Russian territory. I mean, how bad is this for Vladimir Putin?
So I think we've gone through stages of the Ukrainians thinking, what will it take to stop the Russians and stop the Russian invasion and to get them to meaningfully agree to meaningful peace talks and withdrawals of troops. And that started, in the first 6 months of the war, the Ukrainians thought, we just need to hold out a certain amount of time and Russia will have used up its armaments. We've now seen that Russia has increased its armaments production. They then thought we need to kill a certain number of Russians, 200,000, and then the social upheaval will be so great that Putin will not be able to stay in power. We're now at what the Ukrainians say is 250,000 killed and certainly hundreds of thousands of people wounded in this war. And still that hasn't had the major upheaval effect that they'd expected in Russian society. In fact, you've had people leaving Russia, and you had the Prigozhin mutiny, but that seems to have somehow been amicably resolved, with Prigozhin now even attending conferences in St. Petersburg. So it's difficult for the Ukrainians to know what they can do to bring the Russians to the peace table. And I think, in the meantime, Russia is still pounding Ukrainian cities. So they've decided we'll show that this can go two ways, and we'll start trying to hit military targets and government targets in Moscow and show that there is a weakness in the Russian regime. So I think that's already becoming a pattern. We've seen consistent drone attacks over the past few weeks. There have also throughout the war been a lot of fires on military industrial complexes in Russia. There was a fire at this particular complex last year, and now there's an almighty great explosion with which is an enormous mushroom cloud going up from it. We don't know what the cause of that is yet. Russian authorities are saying that there's a human cause, but we don't know if it's a drone or if there were explosives moved into the plant. And we don't know who carried that out, if that's Russian partisans or people that the Ukrainians have paid in order to carry out activities, or indeed the work of the special forces that I've been talking to.
I mean, it's a bit ironic, isn't it? Because, we look at Ukraine and they've really been able to enhance their anti-missile technology to mean that, we are seeing strikes on Ukrainian cities, but there's also a lot more that they're being able to, make sure that they aren't reaching residential buildings. And during the mutiny, there were some commentators talking on our station saying, actually this proves that Russia may not be able to defend itself anymore. And maybe all of this does show that Russia's military just isn't in a state to be able to defend its borders anymore.
Well, it's a huge border with Ukraine, and it's about really where the troops are located. So if Ukraine was able to launch a counteroffensive in the Belgorod and Bryansk regions, I think you'd see a very different result from the counteroffensive. There are not significant defensive in those regions. And if it was a traditional war where one country attacks the other and then another country retaliates by attacking the other country's territory, Ukraine could obviously make significant progress in the north. But because it has these restrictions imposed by the West with regard to the supply of Western weapons, it can't do that. It has to focus its resources in the obvious places. And that is where Russia has significant power, and it still has incredible fleet in the Black Sea with incredible missile capabilities that Ukraine doesn't have. It's still a very one-sided aerial battle when it comes to cruise missiles and hypersonic missiles. These are much more powerful, much larger, much more difficult to hit Ukrainian drones. Russia seems to be struggling with it because there are a lot of them. These drones are cheap. It's the same as the kind of Shahed drones, the Iranian drones that are being used against Ukrainian cities. They just fly en masse, and some of them get through. And it's difficult to. They're quite small. It's difficult to see them on radar. You need to have line of sight to shoot them down. And Russia just doesn't have the same layered defenses as Kiev does. But there are lots of other cities in Ukraine that are still very vulnerable to Russian aerial attack. And that's why they're so keen to have more Patriot missile systems that can defeat ballistic missiles, which are hard to shoot down, and more of the kind of British supplied ASRAAM missiles rigged onto a Supercat truck that we revealed in our article, because they helped shoot down these swarms of Shahed drones.
We're also seeing tensions rise kind of on other borders with Russia and Belarus. I mean, along the border of Belarus, Poland is sending 2,000 troops to the border due to fears of the Wagner group kind of setting up camp there and some hostility along that border. Should we be genuinely worried about more tension in this region, or do you think it might be a false flag?
I don't think the Russians will be looking for a war with NATO. I don't think that Poland. I mean, Poland is right to move troops there because it might encounter some subversive activities, but it won't be an all out invasion of the type that Ukraine has experienced. And Russia really doesn't have the resources at this point to certainly not to fight NATO, let alone to mount a significant incursion into Poland. There is still a threat to Ukraine from Belarus. Belarus is still very close to Kiev, and Ukraine will have to watch out for that. But Shoigu's comments today about deploying significant resources to the border with Finland look very hollow, because there are no available resources to spare along the border with NATO. They haven't put resources there for the past few months, knowing that Finland is going to become a NATO member. And because simply they don't want a war with NATO. They know that they couldn't win a war with NATO. It's increasingly clear, especially at this point. So what is the point in allocating your resources there?
Is it distraction though? Do they think that maybe this will distract the West, or Poland and Finland or NATO from Ukraine?
It's the same as the nuclear threat. It's a consistent threat of escalation in order to scare Western politicians away from supporting Ukraine and giving Ukraine the support that it needs. And they've consistently offered red lines. Red lines have been crossed, and they haven't been able to escalate. So it's the same kind of saber rattling. It's hollow saber rattling with the tools that they think they have to scare Western politicians.
That was Maxim Tucker. He's the former Kyiv correspondent for The Times, and now he's an assistant editor on our foreign desk. Thank you so much to Maxim for providing us with that fantastic insight. If you want to hear more from Maxim Tucker, go to times.radio/subscribe. All of his articles come with fantastic maps and videos and incredible analysis of the inside of the war in Ukraine.